To our viewing audience, welcome to a webinar by the National Association of Scholars. This is a webinar that we've titled When Prophecy Flails, the problem of overconfident experts in uncertain times. The title, I'm sure many of you will recognize, is a play on that 1950s classic sociological work, When Prophecy Fails, which actually dealt with a millenarian cult in Minnesota. And Minnesota plays a big part in our lives these days, so I thought a little homage there would be appropriate. Joining us for this conversation are Roger Kimball, Alexander Riley, Sally Satel, and maybe, I'm hoping, Julie Kelly. I'm going to introduce them in that order. Each of these people has a resume long enough that I could take up the hour reciting it, so I won't. Roger Kimball is America's all-round man of letters, the editor and publisher of the New Criterion, the publisher of Encounter Books, the author of 6 or 7, I've lost track, of important books, starting, I think, with Tenured Radicals at the end of the 1980s, How Politics Corrupted Higher Education. That's not his only theme. He has also paid a great deal of intelligent attention to the arts in America, as well as our politics. His bachelor's degrees from Bennington College, his MA and PhD in philosophy are from Yale. And among his Yale connections is that he currently chairs the board of the William F. Buckley Jr. Society at Yale. I invited Roger to this particular occasion knowing that since the very beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, he has been writing very trenchant essays about the nature of that crisis, and he has pivoted into dealing with the crisis of our burning cities. Well, I know authors don't always get to choose the titles of the articles that appear in the popular press, but Roger's article of a couple weeks ago in the Epoch Times came out under the title, "Those Burning Our Cities Aim to Destroy Our Civilization," which I say is a pretty good condensation of one of the themes that we're going to be dealing with today. That article begins, the first thing to understand about the destructive mob sweeping the country is that they are not race riots. I butchered that a little bit, but you get the idea. This webinar began, the idea was inspired when Alexander Riley, who's a sociology professor at Bucknell University, submitted an article to NAS titled "The Failure of the New Class Under the COVID," missing the title here, under the test of the COVID-19. And that article was a long look back to the rise of the cult of expertise in the political movement that we now call progressivism. We once called it that, we're calling that again. His gaze rose to the broader issue of just how does a free republic deal with the need for experts without becoming captured by experts. And I expect he will have something more to say about that. His PhD is from the University of San Diego. He has another half shelf full of books on things like the impure play. He has wonderful titles. The totalitarian legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, the social thought of Emil Durkheim. So we're talking about a serious sociological scholar here who has decided to engage issues of public moment and has been doing that rather nicely over the last couple of years. You will see his articles in places like American Greatness. Sally Satel is our physician. She is a psychiatrist, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, but with a very interesting, complicated background. She also, I believe, is still a staff psychiatrist at a methadone maintenance clinic in Washington. She has been a policy fellow for the Senate Labor and Human Relations Committee, a faculty member at Yale in psychiatry. Her BS degree is from Cornell with a MS degree from University of Chicago and her MD from Brown University. She is also a public intellectual in the best sense. She has maintained a high expertise in key areas and brought that into our public discussions. Her most recent contribution that caught my eye and had me invite her to this event was an article titled "The Public Health Establishment Has Diminished Its Credibility." And I tend to think that that's true, but I'd like her to explain it as we go on. The fourth person, who you don't yet see on your screen because she has been preempted by Mr. Prager for his broadcast, but she may be joining us late in this one, is Julie Kelly. She's a political commentator whose numerous writings are found in places like American Greatness, The Federalist, The National Review, Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, where she lives in Chicago, and Forbes. She's been a communications consultant for various Republican candidates, writes on topics ranging from food policy and agriculture to biotechnology. And the article that she wrote that caught my attention was simply titled "The Suicide of Expertise," rather similar, but perhaps a little bit more hard-edged than Sally's similar article. So with that, I'm going to call on Roger to open us up.
Well, thank you, Peter. I hope everyone joining us appreciates my colorful background. This is the coronavirus, and I'm not frightened of it, and you shouldn't be either. It's a respiratory virus that can be very dangerous for vulnerable people, but most of us aren't vulnerable to it, and most people who are exposed to it and get it have very mild or even no symptoms. So on the theme of experts and expertise, I think what we've seen over these last few months as we have attempted to commit suicide in public by shuttering the world's most dynamic economy is that the experts are not very expert. If you go back and canvass the pronouncement of St. Anthony Fauci over the months, you will see that he's been wildly inconsistent. Is it okay to go on a cruise? Someone asked him in the middle of March. Sure, if you're young and healthy, no worries about it. And then all of a sudden, no, you must not appear anywhere without a mask. Just a week or two ago, he said, well, wearing a mask is really, it's a sign of politeness to other people. It's a symbolic gesture. Well, it strikes me that this amazing thing we have just seen over the last several months traces a trajectory that is very disturbing. We have gone from give me liberty or give me death at one point to cowering, quivering in place, and treating our fellow citizens like lepers. It strikes me as a ridiculous exercise that we've gone through. And of course, we saw what happened to our economy, the shedding of trillions of dollars of wealth from the stock market. And then 40 million people, more or less, lost their jobs. How many of those jobs are going to come back? I mean, we've had some good news in the last few weeks, but it's going to be a long time before things return to normal, if they do return to normal. People talk a lot about the new normal. The new normal is going to be that restaurants will have to operate at 25 or 50% capacity, and similar rules about social distancing will be in place for the foreseeable future, however long that is, for large gatherings. That is not normal. That's not a new normal. That is the institutionalization of abnormality, I would say. And as we look back on what we've done to ourselves, I think it's very important to think about our appetite for risk. Life is a risky enterprise. You cross the street, you're taking your life in your hands. You get into a car, you're driving along the highway. That's a risky thing. Now, we could reduce risk quite a bit. If the speed limit were 5 miles an hour, for example, we would save a lot of lives. 20 people a year, more or less, I'm told, are hospitalized, and some die from the effects of pigeon dung in New York City. Should we then kill all the pigeons? Actually, that might not be a bad idea, but let's say that we don't want to do that, that we think that assuming some risk is a healthy thing. There are several epidemiologists, many of whom were censored. Actually, I mean, their articles were taken down, their interviews were taken off YouTube, who argue that the best way of treating this virus was to let it run its course. You protect the vulnerable, the elderly. You don't do what Andrew Cuomo did and force nursing homes to take patients who have COVID. That's like sending someone in with a machine gun. And you know, he probably killed 10,000 people by that order. And otherwise, you just go about your business. We should not have, in my opinion, should not have closed the schools. We should have taken reasonable precautions. Yes, we should have, if you feel badly, you should stay home, you should wash your hands. But otherwise, we should have gotten on with our lives, and we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have sunk the US economy and sent the country into a state of insanity and pandemonium. I'm glad that Sally Satel is with us, because I think we really need a psychiatrist's insight into what happened to our culture. I mean, this is really an extraordinary thing that we have just done in public. And I hope we learn from it, never to do it again. I could go on, but
all right,
I won't.
Over to Alex.
Yes, thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here to have a conversation with this this wonderful group and with the folks who are listening. I'll try to be very brief. That's a good model that Roger sets for us. So I'll do my best, although my track record is not great on this. I'm going to summarize very quickly some of the things that I said in the piece that Peter referred to, because it deals with some details in the history and sociology of intellectuals and of expertise that folks who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that rather abstruse topic may not know much about. The inspiration of the piece really was a book written about 40 years ago by an American sociologist named Alvin Gouldner, in which he dealt with what he called the problem or the question of the new class. And by the new class, he simply meant the class of intellectuals, of experts, who were defined fundamentally by their educational credentials, but increasingly by lots of other cultural credentials and cultural characteristics as well. And Gouldner, in the late 70s, early 80s, and this is, in fact, he was taking a place in a long line of social thinkers and political theorists who were trying to figure out, really in the last century or so, I think we've seen a pretty concentrated effort to try to do this. Theorists and thinkers trying to figure out what's the role and the place in modern societies of this new emerging class of folks, of people, again, highly educationally pedigreed, who tend to have a fairly, if not uniform, at least a worldview that separates them to some degree from a lot of other groups in society. What's the place that they occupy in this society? And especially Gouldner interested in the question of what's going to be their political role? What's going to be the place that they take in the American and in the Western political orders? And so Gouldner said there are a number of different, just based on what we know about how when new social political classes emerge, and especially when they're elite classes that claim a certain kind of expertise. Obviously, the new intellectuals had, in the last 100 years or so, they had a claim that they could make to refer to an objective kind of expertise. We have science on our side. We're the technological experts. Here's the evidence of our expertise. Look at all the technological machinery that we can produce and that operates successfully, does all sorts of stuff that we like and that's helpful for us. And so that's the evidence of our expertise. Gugner asked the question, what are they going to do with that, with the power that comes along with that expertise? So he presented a number of different scenarios. Gugner was ultimately relatively optimistic about what was going to happen. He thought the new class, even though he was very careful to point out what he thought were some of the flaws of the new class, which indeed were, in his view, flaws that are inherent, if you will, in human nature. Basically, that they would almost inevitably, the new class would, in addition to the claims that they were making about being interested in objective truth and being interested in helping society with a capital S and not just enriching themselves and making themselves more powerful, Gugner recognized that human beings are almost constitutionally incapable of doing that fully. We are self-interested. We do find ways ultimately, unless we have lots of controls of this, we find ways to get our own interests realized over against the interest of others in lots of scenarios. So he was somewhat skeptical, but he also was optimistic at the end of the day about what the new class would do in terms of its new political power. In the piece that I wrote that Peter referred to, I just used COVID-19 as an empirical example to say, let's test what Alvin Gugner had to say, what he thought about how the new class would deal with its new power. And my view in the article is that, as the title indicates, is that the COVID-19 case was an indication of the failure of the new class to use that power in the way that Gugner hoped they would. That in fact you found, and we're still finding, innumerable examples of members of the new class, and I would say even the new class as a whole, as a class category, using that power in ways to advance their own political and social ends and goals. And doing this in particular kinds of ways. Some of the ways that I point out in the article that the new class does this, in the COVID case and in other cases, is that they use the narrative of expertise in a way that in fact is ultimately dishonest. And it isn't even consistent with the way in which expertise emerged as a real cultural phenomenon in the Western world. So one of the things I point out in the article with a number of examples is just the way in which very frequently claims are made in the popular media, and very frequently too by intellectuals who are not journalists, and they're not writing on sites like CNN, but in more prestigious scholarly sites. They would often say, well, here's the situation. The experts say X. And then, of course, there are other things that other people are saying that are contrary to what the experts say, but they're not experts. And so the narrative, rhetorical way in which the discussion is set up from the beginning was always experts versus non-experts. I go through a number of those examples in my text in which I just say, that's very frequently a mendacious way of presenting what's actually happening. In fact, what's often happening is that you've got different groups of experts who disagree, and they're presenting different perspectives, and they're presenting their evidence. And the real scientific, intellectual way of trying to weed through that and to figure out what's going on is to consider the evidence on the various sides and to get into the discussion, which is very difficult, of what the evidence actually shows. That almost never happens in the public sphere with respect to COVID-19 or with respect to lots of other similarly charged kinds of issues today. Instead, what happens is, again, this kind of, it's the experts all on one side saying X, and anybody on the other side who's saying anything else is by definition not an expert. And so they can be rejected. That's one of the things, and I can say a lot more. I can get into some of those details in the discussion if folks would like to. The other thing I say a little bit about in the piece, and I'll conclude with this, is just the idea that the rhetorical strategy that I think you see very frequently in the discussion by this expert class, by what Gugner calls the new class of COVID-19, is what I characterize as alarmism. That is, there's an almost innate tendency on the part of the new class that whenever some significant social issue or problem emerges, there's almost an innate tendency on their part to see this as a potentially catastrophic fundamental challenge to more or less the entirety of the American institutional structure. There's a complicated argument that goes into this, and so I won't be able to do more than just touch on it now, but what I say in the piece is just, I indicate that this has a lot to do with who the new class are. Culturally, where they come from, politically, what tend to be their worldviews, or in fact, I think they're more or less coherent worldview as a class. And this can be distinguished from the worldview and the political sensibilities of lots of other Americans who often, again, they're just as interested as the expert classes are in knowing what the case is, what is the real risk of COVID-19, et cetera. But they often tend to come at this with a de facto starting point that isn't the starting point of alarmism. I use this piece that Nick Kristof wrote in the New York Times as the main example of the alarmism, where he purports to say, well, here are two different scenarios. You know, I've talked to a bunch of experts. Here are two different ways that COVID-19 could play out. One is really bad, and one is not quite so bad. And there's a kind of facade of even-handedness in the piece, but when you actually read the piece, it's pretty clear. Kristof is leaning very heavily in the direction of, it's all going to fall apart. It's catastrophe. This is Armageddon. This is the Black Plague. There are going to be millions of American dead. This is a narrative that was found very frequently among a bunch of these prognostications. Again, I'd make a long list of them in the piece. Many of them failed to come to fruition. Many of them failed to actually show any evidence of accuracy. And the way that the new class dealt with that, in fact, was not to say in a humble kind of way, well, we had some models, we made some predictions, they were wrong, maybe we need to discuss this again, maybe we need to actually listen a little bit more to some of the competing discourses rather than to frame them as non-experts. Again, that almost never happens either. What the new class does is they just move on from the failed catastrophic prediction that they just made, and they start making new catastrophic predictions based on whatever information they can gather today. So the upshot of the piece is just to say that, I think as Peter nicely summarized it, we're in a difficult situation in modern democracies like this one. We clearly need expert voices. There are certain conversations, there are certain topics that are so specialized and so difficult, and it requires so much information that no one who isn't a specialist in that can be expected to master it. And so we need those people, we need those groups of folks, those institutions that do that. And yet we also have to be wary of the pitfalls of giving the new class as much power as we've given them, because again, I think as Goulder was predicting, and I would say the evidence indicates he wasn't quite as pessimistic as he should have been on this. There are all sorts of ways in which the new class can go wrong as well.
Sally?
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Peter. I'm going to talk about public health and medicine, and of course that's in the spotlight these days because of our pandemic, and also because of the recent protest in the sense that the public health community has christened racism a public health problem. So, you know, it's 20 years ago, I wrote a book called PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine. And it is back in full bloom for us to see. And that book, very briefly, each chapter was devoted to a manifestation of how the medical profession and the public health, not as a block, but you know, a fair percentage of the membership of those communities, how they were eliding the fact-value separation, which is a very important chasm to keep separate when you're talking about health. I mean, you can talk about values, but you have to be explicit that you are moving into that realm, and also of the injection and infiltration of victim politics into appraisal of health problems. So I thought one of the most glaring violations of fact-value separation was when was the response of many in the public health world to the protests. I will quote you, for example, a prominent public health faculty member at Johns Hopkins. She says, in this moment, she's referring to the protests, because of course, up until the weekend of May 31st, we weren't supposed to congregate in large groups and not wear masks. And I'm probably a little more cautious of this compared to Roger. In a way, a lot of this is a Rorschach for how you perceive risk, and my personal bias is that I'm probably a little more cautious than most, may have a little bit to do with a pre-existing medical problem. But in any case, that was undeniably their general advice. And, but that advice was clearly, there was a lot of wiggle room. Here's what she said. In this moment, the public health risks of not protesting to demand an end to systemic racism greatly exceed the harms of the virus. That's a pretty incredible thing for a public health person to say. And that was followed a few days later by an open letter from about 1,300 public health experts. About half of them had advanced degrees and were with universities. Others, I think, were students. Quoting them in the context of the marches, that they were vital to the national public health and to the threatened health specifically of Black people. Now, they did counsel everyone to wear their masks and try to march 6 feet apart and disinfect, but they also made clear that these similar risk toleration, so for example, tolerating such risk if people were to go to church or a pro-life rally or this kind of thing, particularly, and then they identified a particular risk of some of the lockdown protests. So particularly lockdown protests against stay-at-home orders, those which were, quote, rooted in white nationalism and run contrary to respect for Black lives, there the risks were not worth taking. And obviously the double standard is striking. One could say the same about Governors DeSantis and Kemp in Georgia and Florida, respectively, who felt compelled by the economic devastation and also just the social isolation that people were experiencing, and the I won't call it mental illnesses resulting from that, except for perhaps in a small population of people with pre-existing problems, but still there was a fair amount of psychic anguish from that kind of separation from friends and colleagues, and heaven forbid a relative who was in the hospital, or heaven forbid a relative who died. But those risks apparently, I'll refer to this, the quote, but those risks apparently did not greatly exceed the harms of the virus. In other words, the risk of economic fallout and social isolation, those did not exceed the risks. Now, bemoaning the double standard is one thing, and I bemoan it like many others, but it goes past that to a much more pernicious development in public health, which is the sense that their opinions of what is appropriate is even something that should be part of the dialogue. In other words, public health, the job of public health is to give people the best, and admittedly there have been problems in what the best advice is, but let's assume it's been in good faith. The best estimate, the best objective estimate of risks, that's their job, to give us the best objective estimates of risk, not whether those risks are worth taking. That's not their job. And whether those risks are taking is my choice, and it was the choice of those folks who marched, and it was perfectly acceptable to participate in expression that way in this country. They felt that that risk was worth taking, and that was their decision. I think, and that was on a personal level. On a larger level, governors and mayors would make that risk about their own cities and states. We might disagree with how they weighed, what their balance, what their calculus was in terms of protecting health versus protecting environment and other domains. But the point is that was their decision. That was the proper location of deciding what was worth risking, not the public health profession. So I think that this whole episode was a very striking example of a serious self-inflicted wound that public health incurred. And we can all pay the price for something like this, in addition to the credibility of that profession taking a hit. Bottom line is we're the ones who are hurt, because it really does now make you wonder how much we can trust the advice of folks like that professor at Johns Hopkins and many others. The former health commissioner of New York weighed in. He said you could, he didn't have any flaming rhetoric about social justice, but he said you can protest and protect yourself. Well, I'm sure there are things one could do to lessen the risk when one is protesting, but that advice is not going to be given for the rally that's happening on Saturday, I think, that you know, the president is having. So I want to just talk about it, just one other manifestation, and the other one, because these are both very much in the moment, but there's a number of domains in which public health experts have really given a lot of misinformation, and I'd say politicized information. I won't go into those, but I'll preview them because I've written a lot about them. One is the opioid epidemic, and the other is the vaping situation. A lot of half-truths and outright misrepresentations in those domains. But I just also want to mention with respect to the march that you know, one of the big contingencies in the march were a group of young doctors and residents called White Coats for Black Lives. And to the extent that I know some people indirectly who are involved with it, they are very passionate and well-meaning young people. There's no question about this. But there's an incredible amount of rhetoric now about, and this is pretty much the line they take, dismantling systemic racism within medicine. I cannot tell you how many press releases I got from the Lancet, from the American Medical Association, from the American Academy of I can't remember their exact name, but basically every specialized medical group has made the you know, obligate statement that they are against racism, and who isn't, of course. But some went quite far, and again, talking about systemic racism within medical schools and medicine in particular. And you know, you have to realize in a way that public health and medicine, especially public health, it's always had a reformist spirit, and because it goes back to, I mean, one of the most famous examples took place in 1854 of John Snow, who took a pump off a water, took a handle off a water pump on Broad Street in London because that particular pump was disseminating water with cholera. He had the pump removed. That was a beginning of, well, I guess the Romans and the Greeks already started, you know, sanitation efforts. But I mean, that's always been a public health issue, and that's always had ties to policy reform, because these are changes that have to take place on a social level. You have to have a sewage system, you have to have health surveillance, you have to have clean water, you have to have all these things. And doctors and public health people are so important to that. There's no question. The thing that worries me, though, is that these are specific things. They are proximate to the mission of public health. And when, I'll conclude with this, there's more to say, but that when doctors march for and talk about dismantling systemic racism in healthcare, I'm not even sure quite what that means. There certainly are disparate health outcomes in medicine, no question about that. They need attention. There's no question about that either. But there are more direct ways to improve those problems. And I do worry that the curriculum now is going to be a little bit too infused with essentially mild versions of it. Well, sensitivity training and implicit bias education. And as a side note, I would say that almost all of the race implicit bias work has been largely debunked in terms of having any relevance to real world behavior. So I also see, and I'll close with this, I mean, doctors are people, they can always advance any particular policy they want as individuals. There can even be doctors for single payer, but then they're advertising what it is they're for. But when there are, when there's an entire organization that represents the profession, and I'm just saying like the AMA, they haven't said anything yet, but like the AMA, to come out with a particular policy, that is an intolerable politicization of the field. We should, as a group, generally lobby for outcomes, better health outcomes, but be very cautious about specifying the kind of policy we feel needs to get there, because that's not necessarily our expertise. It politicizes the profession and diminishes trust, and it also siphons off time and energy from things we know how to do to really help people's health. Thank you.
Thank all three of you. I'm going to take my privilege as moderator to see if I can pose a question to all of you. Taking the new class model as a starting point, there's an element of self-interest that infects the decisions that experts make. They may not always be aware of that, but when experts do say something, one presumes that, first of all, they believe what they're saying is true, or at least they believe that what they're saying advances a higher policy goal than the truth. That's possible. But they are always putting their credibility on the line. There's this risk that what you say is so patently not true, or false, or misleading, that their future credibility is going to be hampered. If that's the case, where's the self-interest in that? How can you be self-interested and also at the same time be willing to exaggerate, to produce models that turn out to be catastrophic in themselves rather than dealing with catastrophes that are out there? I'm going to start by asking Roger that.
Well, Peter, I think that a good example of the phenomenon you're talking about is those nearly daily press conferences at which the American public was treated not only to the wit and wisdom of Dr. Anthony Fauci, but also the really rather astonishing scarf collection of Dr. Birx. They were probably the most famous people in the country for a month or two, and among the certainly celebrity is one of them. And I think craving for approval that is an ingredient in the human heart was probably overfed for Drs. Fauci and Birx during that 6 or 8 weeks when they were standing there next to the president, terrifying the American public. So I think that's one element of self-interest. Of course, I think many experts, so-called, also they count on the truth of others. Julie, they count on the truth of H.L. Mencken's observation that no one ever went broke underestimating the stupidity of the American public. They know how short people's memories are, and it's one of the amazing things of being not only a member of the public health establishment, but all of these representatives of the so-called new class. The fact that they're wrong over and over again doesn't make any difference. It's the examples are too numerous to cite, but it's as long as they can say something with a loud enough megaphone in a prominent enough place, they will be maybe not forgiven, but certainly their wrong predictions will be forgotten, I think.
Julie, welcome to our webinar. And I've already introduced you, so you're coming in as a known figure, and you are in time to give us whatever condensation of your views on these matters are. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry for the delay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Roger and I'm not sure what the discussion was beforehand, but we've been one of the few handful of voices since really the coronavirus crisis began in March, and being highly skeptical of the science, allegedly the science that was behind it. And so we've done a lot of research, and I think from my vantage point, the reason I was so skeptical early on is because I saw a lot of the same patterns that we have seen with climate change, right? The same people, the same interests, the same approach, the same kind of draconian measures that needed to be taken to mitigate this. And the goalposts kept changing too, which we've also seen in climate science. And so I think that as it progressed, as the goalposts kept changing, as the mitigation measures kept getting more harsh and harsh, it was necessary to start raising some very important questions about what we were being told, who was telling it to us, how often their story was changing, and most importantly, the consequences of these lockdown measures, and how devastating it's been on so many levels. And so I think that that is what we try to add to the conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy you were able to get away from Dennis Prager long enough to give us some time.
Yes.
I was posing a general question about the motivations of the experts. And Roger has answered it essentially with the idea of vanity, that experts are subject to seeking public approval, and the prognostications they make today may not matter. They're living for the moment and know that tomorrow's prognostications could be quite different, that no one will remember. The trouble is we do remember, and I'm going to go back to Alexander on that. There is a public memory here. There's also a written record, and it would seem to me that the credibility of a substantial class of experts has been dented by these affairs. It hasn't gone into the memory hole yet, has it?
No, you're absolutely right. It certainly, some of the effects that you're talking about do happen, and they have happened at the level of the public. And that's, as I think, that's the biggest potential problem with this. When you have an expert class who does the things that we've all been talking about, more or less systematically, and the public can fact check, and they can recognize that, not only did you get it wrong, but you didn't even say you got it wrong before, and so now we have to rethink it. And again, that more intellectually humble position that I indicated in my opening remarks, that creates a real problem for. I ended the piece that I wrote for you, Peter, with this sentiment. If the expert class is unhappy with the fact that increasingly the public doesn't trust them, who can they blame for that but themselves? The fact that the decision making that they've done has been so demonstrably wrong on some important issues, and not just wrong, but uncorrected. That's going to matter at the level of, I think the reason that it doesn't matter so much at the level of expert opinion has to do with, if you will, with the sociology, the internal sociology of what Goulder called the new class. As I indicated at the beginning, in the beginning remark, and this gets exacerbated over time, but even from the very beginning, I think this new class that Goulder is talking about, the intellectuals as a group, when they emerge, there's a pretty distinct set of political and cultural predispositions to this group. They tend to lean politically left pretty clearly from the very beginning. If you talk about the birth of the modern intelligentsia in the West, that's complicated to get into the details, but the big story that often is told by historians here is you go back and you look at the mobilization of intellectuals as a political group around the Dreyfus affair in France at the turn of the last century. And pretty clearly what was happening there is that intellectuals were mobilizing as left-leaning critics of established political social institutions like the military and like the aristocracy, the political establishment, the ruling elite, if you will. Sometimes even the criticisms were even more staunchly targeted at even what we might call even more fundamental Western institutions. But that's there from the beginning. This only gets exacerbated over time. The intellectual class, I think, has become even more politically and culturally uniform over time. There's lots of evidence of this in the research. John Haidt's Heterodox Academy site has a ton of information online in the way of the research that shows that, I'll just speak, for example, real briefly about in my discipline. It used to be the case even a half century ago that you could find sociologists who were political moderates, who were even political conservatives. One of the first sociologists who I got interested in as a student in reading was Robert Nisbet, an American sociologist who wrote a whole bunch of stuff on community and on political thought from basically from the political right. He was well respected. He had a prestigious institutional position, etc. In the 50 years since then, since that period that I'm talking about, that's all gone. There are no more of those sociologists left really. The whole discipline has moved in this very clear way even further in this politically uniform direction. That has consequences for how decision-making gets made at the level of elite groups. There's much less likelihood that within an elite intellectual group, if they make a decision, they make a prognostication, it turns out to be egregiously false, and it can be demonstrated that at least part of the reason why it was false was that it was probably motivated by some political bias or some other issues. There's very little likelihood that within the group you're going to get any kind of interest in going, hey, let's think about that. Instead the tendency is to go, no, let's shore up our group identity. Let's make sure that we protect our own. Let's make sure that we recognize the larger political and social struggles that we're parts of. We don't want to reveal any weakness to these horrible political enemies, especially in the wake of the 2016 election. I think this whole dynamic, which was around before then, it's basically on steroids since then. You can fairly effectively predict in intellectual elite classes, if there's a problematic issue or a debated issue in the public, if the president has a position on it, you can almost be guaranteed that the expert class's de facto position is going to say it has to be the opposite of what the president thinks.
I'm going to stop you there because we have to watch our time. Sally?
Sure.
You're muted. The joys of Zoom.
Yeah.
Well, while Sally is sorting that out, Julie, do you have anything you'd like to jump in with?
Sure. I wrote right after the election because I was covering scientific issues, and there was this kind of tenuous ceasefire between the agricultural community and the scientific community. I wrote a lot about agricultural biotechnology, also known as GMOs. So there was this group of us who were writing about it and speaking about it. On election night, I noticed right away there was this huge divide. So whatever connection there was before that just broke open, and I saw really truly hateful things being said by scientists and experts about agricultural community, farmers, etc., who had dared to vote for Donald Trump. And I wrote a piece for National Review in November of 2016 warning about the politicization of science. And we could see that the scientific community and the experts from the beginning, especially of the Trump presidency after the election, they have gone out of their way to thwart the president and his agenda. And so it wasn't just climate, it wasn't just what was happening at the EPA. They were very successful, this horrible crusade that they launched against Scott Pruitt, trying to get him out of there, making all these dire claims about what was going to happen to the environment and anything related to science after Trump was elected. Of course, it didn't happen. And so then we got to this crisis, and unfortunately, I think he listened to people that he probably should not have. But I think the biggest revelation was how the experts, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys have addressed this yet, but how the experts changed their tune from the lockdown protests that were happening, especially in the Michigan Capitol, versus the Black Lives Matter protests and the protests against George Floyd's death, and then of course the rioting and looting. suddenly social distancing was out the window. Any kind of face covering was okay. And they actually had experts signing off on letters saying that, well, we can set aside the social distancing, I call it pseudoscience, because social justice is more important than how we might be spreading the virus. So it was just one more example of hypocritical, really, scientific community. We see this with climate change, right? You see experts, or you see scientists who became celebrities like a Michael Mann, or you see celebrities themselves who talk a really good game about how we should eliminate fossil fuels, you know, once they step off their private jet. Bernie Sanders is another example. So this rank hypocrisy, I think the general public is starting to kind of catch on to and see that. And so I think that that's kind of what broke loose after these riots and protests. People saw the double standard there, and hopefully it will apply to some of the other politically motivated science that we've been kind of brainwashed with over the last few decades too.
Say, Peter, could I just jump in?
Can I just,
Yeah.
I'm about to say right after
yes.
Alexander was finishing, is another elite group, I think, that played a large role in the dynamic was the media. And to the extent that there are clearly preferred voices in this debate, to the point where, at least earlier on, I think a lot of folks in the public didn't even know there was another side. And they tend to just flood the space so effectively with one version, with one narrative, that unless you're paying close attention, or this is, an area that you're somewhat knowledgeable about, I think it's easy for people, well-meaning, otherwise smart enough folks, but to really be seduced by experts. I think that adds to the power of that seduction.
Roger?
Yeah. Well, I've several times, and when I'm writing about this subject, have mentioned a brilliant and amusing book by Charles Mackay called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it seems to me that the response to this year's Chinese flu really could easily provide an addendum to that book, because where I live in Connecticut, we live in a little sort of semi-isolated neighborhood, and many of the people walk around the neighborhood wearing a mask. In the response to one neighborhood questionnaire, one lady said, "I'm just wondering, should I wear a mask in my own front yard?" I mean, it's just, it's a species of insanity. And Sally's absolutely right about the media narrative. It is monolithic. And it's not just on coronavirus, of course. One of you mentioned earlier getting notices from, I think it was you, Sally, getting notices from various professional organizations about their solidarity with the Black community and their worry about systematic racism and so on. Well, it's not just professional organizations. It's every business or club that you've ever had anything to do. Anybody who has your email address, when the coronavirus was the news of the moment, they would send you these nauseating appeals to stay safe. And now it's a little notices of it's a kind of professional virtue signaling, announcing their lack of racism and their determination to stamp out this horrible thing, with your help. It really is an extraordinary moment that we're living in, and it seems to me that, just to get back to your earlier question, Peter, one of the reasons why I think that people's memories are short, just to sum it up in two words, is the welfare state. Welfare state. I mean, that's obviously been a huge mistake. It's probably done more to perpetuate racism by institutionalizing dependency than anything, and yet people keep they keep doing it, and there's no penalty for it.
We're going to lose Roger to his schedule very shortly. We will have about a half hour left to take the questions, which I see have been mounting up. I'm going to just try an offhand quick summarization of where we are. The question of what motivates the experts, even when they repeatedly are wrong, and some of the answers have been vanity, polarization that drives people into their own groups on this, a kind of group solidarity that goes with that, antipathy to President Trump and readiness to take a side, whatever side it might be that's opposite of his. The very important idea that Julie brought up about the environment, the whole notion that drives both our two most recent crises of COVID-19 or the Wuhan flu and the Black Lives Matter protests come riots, has had to do with a sense of the ambient environment, which connects, as Julie points out, to our previous hysteria over global warming. I think Sally puts me in mind that there is a hierarchy of values that's always at work in these things. We've decided right now that social justice trumps public health, basically, and then we try to mush them together by saying social justice is public health.
Right.
But we're always dealing with a kind of contention among what we think the worst possible thing is. I've watched the global warming catastrophists in a deep funk for the last several months because their crisis has been derogated to a lower level of existential threat than the virus and now the riots. When this sort of thing happens, what you watch for is the moment where a synthesis is launched and you're told that all these things are really one and the same at a deep level, and that one and the same that they're pointing to is the awfulness of Western civilization. So we have, as a civilization, created many classes of experts, not just physicians, but epidemiologists and sociologists and the like, who are in the business right now of denouncing the civilization that gave them their authority in the first place. There's a paradox there that I kind of revel in, but I think now is the time to, I think, given Roger's thing, do you have a last word before you need to leave us, Roger?
No, I could stand it for another 5 minutes, actually.
Okay. Well, then let us open it to our questions. Have one from Steve Hayward. Welcome, Steve. Comment more than question. Aside from the epistemological defects of the experts, the most astonishing but less remarked upon aspect of the scene is the contempt the government and its experts have shown for the idea of self-government and personal responsibility. Well, hooray for that, but responses. Contempt for self-government. Sally?
I was going to go for the personal responsibility part. And again, in the medical realm, to the extent now that systemic racism is being invoked as the explanation for all kinds of health differentials between minorities and whites, as if that matters, that gap matters. I mean, what the value should be, of course, is everyone being as healthy as they can. But to the extent that this is now among some, the preferred diagnosis, then that undercuts all the kinds of advice that doctors need to give patients about how they have to ensure. There's a large part, especially when it comes to chronic illness, about how people have to, protect themselves. It's not sexy stuff, but it's, taking the medication, the diet, the exercise, the keeping the appointments, all the kinds of things that actually are the what makes chronic health problems so intractable is that people don't follow through. I mean, they have reasons, and especially if, they have poor lives and chaotic lives that may not be their priority, a million reasons. They're good excuses, frankly, And there are all kinds of ways that health systems can help people be more compliant with outreach and this kind of thing. But the larger point is that it really is a mockery of one of the central conceptual institutions of medical diagnosis, which is called a differential diagnosis. So when you come to me with a complaint, you have a headache, I have to go through in my mind a whole list of things it could be, with a brain tumor usually at the bottom, but the thing we fear the most is often the thing you want to rule out, first. But it's probably a headache, it's probably a tension headache, but then we might get a CAT scan, you do a neurological exam, you do a million things, and then you progressively rule out the various diagnoses. But once you have a diagnostic framework up front, you'll be less compelled to look for other more fixable and more accurate explanations for the problem.
Real quickly on that theme, I have been for a number of years compiling examples that I've encountered in my time in the university. Phenomenon that I think you can reasonably talk about is just the disdain, even the contempt that members of the elite class have for members of the non-elite. Mm-hmm. They try to make decisions about their own lives. I mean, it's kind of stuff that I think people who don't rub shoulders with intellectuals in an institution like the one that I'm in every day would probably be astounded by. Sometimes you can find, I'm adding to that list by just looking in the current moment at the social media accounts of lots of intellectuals. There are a couple of them who are fairly high profile, who I think if people saw the things that they say about how contemptuous they are for non-elite people making decisions about the kinds of political, the kinds of social, the kinds of medical questions that Sally was just talking about, folks would be astounded to see that. And it's especially interesting, I think, to me, to see it, that it's often members of the elite classes who outwardly profess a politics of democratic egalitarianism, respect for the masses and interest in people making decisions about their own lives. And when you see them talk about things like this situation with respect to COVID-19, they're completely contemptuous of individuals being able to make any kind of responsible decisions in their own lives. So I think this is another one of the things that happens as a result of elite classes self-segregating, isolating. They hang out only with other people who think like them, socialize with other people who think like them, they work with other people who think like them. Everything takes within that bubble. And so it becomes very easy to think, well, of course, the way that we see things and the way that we would make decisions about our own lives is the only reasonable way that people could make decisions. And anything else, again, is probably crazy. It's probably insane.
Yeah, Peter, I've got to go in just a minute, but just to leave you, just to expand on something that Alexander said. I remember Bill Buckley used to say that liberals are always interested in hearing other points of view, but then are astonished to discover that there are other points of view, because they feel that their what they believe is not an opinion, but it represents virtuous reality. So it's only you deplorable people, to cite Hillary Clinton, who have these retrograde opinions. And so what you do with somebody who has an opinion that is not an opinion, but a perversion, which is what they think, is you don't argue with them, you treat them as a heretic and you try to shut them up. And that's the situation we're in now. I mean, it's if 97% of scientists believe that the world is coming to an end in 10 years because of global warming, then if you dispute that, you must be a bad person. Anyway, this is great. I'm sorry I got the schedule mixed up. I must leave, but thank you all.
Thank you, Roger. Take care.
Good having you. Thank you.
Bye.
I'm going to summarize a bunch of the questions that come in. They seem to be on the same wavelength. It appears that a lot of the listeners to our conversation suspect that what lies behind the exaggerations and other not wholly reliable views of our experts is a desire for power. I suspect that we might have some concurrence with that, but Julie, I'll start with you.
Yes, I actually was going to say power and control is really what motivates them. And just going off of what Alexander said, he is completely right. And they feel entitled to power and control because they are the smart people, right? They went to school the longest, they have the degrees, they have all the letters after their names. So it's impossible for anyone who's not as well educated as they are to be able to make any choices for themselves. And look, I will tell you, as someone with a bachelor's degree in communications from a public college in Illinois, I take this firsthand. When I used to write about GMOs, or I wrote about climate change, or now about coronavirus, which is the worst of all, because I'm not credentialed, because I only have a 4-year college degree and I'm not in a specialized field. The idea is that I'm not entitled, or we are not entitled, to have any input in the discussion. The only thing we're supposed to do is pay for it, right? So we're supposed to cough up all of our tax dollars. We're supposed to shut our businesses down. We're supposed to let our children get brainwashed at colleges that we pay for. But otherwise, we are supposed to stay completely silent because we are not as intelligent and aware and informed as our, I call them, betters with letters. And so that is what drives a lot of their power and control, is that the rest of us are just simply too stupid to have the kind of wisdom and insight that the expert class possesses.
I have a question. I guess maybe Sally is the best person to take this. How do you explain why Korean and Taiwanese health experts and policy decision makers, many of whom had been educated in the US or Europe, manage the crisis better than the United States? You make anything of that?
I really don't have I'm not a sociologist, but I mean, it may have some, this is more of a hypothesis, but maybe they have a more, maybe there's more epistemic humility in that group. I mean, they are, you know, they are more humble in some ways. And maybe that cultural, assuming that is a cultural, an accurate cultural trope, that it also permeates the way they do their science as well. They probably trained in a, obviously trained very rigorously, and so are a lot of Americans, but it's an interesting question to think about how cultural background may influence the way people do science.
I have a question I think was inspired by Julie, but I think I'm going to ask Alexander to take it instead, which is, please discuss today's topic relative to the analysis of global warming. Can you do that?
Oh, sure. I think there, again, as I said, there are a whole range of these kinds of public debates, sciencey issues and questions that are before the public at the moment. The one, I mean, I've thought a bit about the global warming one. The one that I've thought even more about is one that Sally talked about earlier. That is this way in which the idea of systemic racism has been incorporated as a public health, as an aspect of medical science, in fact. I think all of these questions can be thought of fruitfully in the kind of framework that Gouldner presents, that I'm borrowing from. That is just to think fundamentally about what intellectual elite groups as groups, how they operate, and then how they inevitably how they're restricted in some by the nature of their own group organization, the nature of, I mean, Peter, I think you talked about the that I was indicating earlier as a kind of group solidarity. I think some folks might go even further and to say you can see in some of these intellectual groups a phenomenon that looks a lot like what we used to call groupthink, where it becomes almost impossible to counter the consensus of the group, because again, there are real risks for that if you're in a group that has more or less total uniformity of thought. And so global warming is another one of these issues where it becomes really difficult in certain settings. Certainly in a university setting, I've encountered this, just to ask questions even about, well, what do we know? What do we actually know about, you know, there are models that predict here's what's going to happen. in 15 years or 20 years or 30 years. I'm one of those people who just, more or less by nature, I like to raise scandalous questions and say, listen, well, models have been wrong before. Let's talk about the model that you're looking at. Can we go through the details and look at that? And very frequently, you get pushback even at that level. Why would you even want to question that? Why would you want to go there? Don't you realize that even in bringing that question up, you're potentially aligning yourself with dangerous, scary people who are not scientific and who have scary political agendas? And it becomes very difficult even just to take the stance, which I'm generally trying to take there as an intellectual, and saying, listen, I'm doing what I think is our job as intellectuals. I'm being skeptical. I'm saying, especially on these complicated issues, let's not assume that the science is finished. I've taught for 20 years and written for 20 years on the sociology of scientific knowledge. I know a good deal about how, as human groups, how scientists work and how science has evolved as a result of sociological processes. So I know that a lot of things that we think, we read history books and we think, well, at some point, time A, they thought X was the case, and then the science revealed that it wasn't the case, and everybody immediately agreed and changed their minds. It never works that way. It's always more complicated. And so then you can raise the question, do we really know what we think we know now? Certainly the models have to be looked at with some skepticism. One real quick example that I've gotten in trouble with just by raising this over the last couple of weeks here locally. There was a New York Times piece, a couple months ago, that presented a model in which it predicted the likelihood of an epidemic outbreak of COVID-19 in every single American county around the country. So there was discussion here locally among some colleagues of mine at the university that I teach at, because there was information there on the county that we're in. At the time that the Times article came out with the model, I think we had like 10 cases or 15 cases total of people who had COVID-19, who had been tested positive for COVID-19 in a county of about 45,000 people. So a tiny little percentage. The New York Times model predicted there was an 85% probability that we had an epidemic in Union County that just hadn't been revealed yet. So immediately on social media and elsewhere, a lot of my colleagues were going, oh my God, it's clear that we need to do this and we need to do that and we need to do this. And if we don't, if you think anything different than that, you're a crazy person, you're dangerous. So several months have gone by since that model came out. Again, I think we had 10 or 15 cases at the time. We're up pretty substantially from that now, but it's still, I think it's a total of about 80 cases in the entire county. Union County, again, 45,000 people. So a tiny little percentage. It's ticked up, whatever, 6, 7, 8-fold. But from a tiny number that it started with, it's still a tiny number overall. There's zero discussion of that in the local communities of the intelligentsia that I'm involved in, just going, hey, do you think maybe that model might have been wrong? You think maybe there might have been some issues that and so again, intellectual humility, maybe the people who raised questions about the model at the time were not evil, but maybe they were just doing the proper job that intellectuals are supposed to do by recognizing models have limits. They get things wrong. We have to be skeptical about this. That becomes very difficult in all these situations. So global warming, I think you could go through the details on this too, and you could show similar things going on there.
Now, there's another question that I think was inspired by Alexander, but I'm going to give it to Julie to write the tables here. In Eisenhower's farewell address, he had 2 warnings, the lesser known second one being the danger of a technocratic elite and government funding of the same. And he mentions Eisenhower's brothers, Milton was a university president. This was in 1961. I think what this is pointing to is that the problem of over-reliance on experts is both an old one and maybe an endemic one to the United States. We can probably go back to the mid-19th century and find examples of over-prediction and over-reliance. But what's our alternative? What can we do about this? Don't we need those experts anyway?
Well, I think, Alexander, I was nodding my head as far as modeling goes. And so the problem is that models now are designed to influence policy. We saw that with the Neil Ferguson model that came out of the Imperial College in the UK. We certainly saw it with the Chris Murray model out of the University of Washington. Those were not legitimate models based on tested data or peer review. Those were models specifically intended to promote lockdown, stay-at-home orders, et cetera. The models changed almost every other day. I think they've been changed at least 24 times, the Murray model. But there's never any consequences. And do you think that anybody will haul Chris Murray in front of a Senate committee and ask him why his models were so off and why they never factored in what was happening at nursing homes, or ask him any questions? No, he's still on CNN spouting off about what's going to happen at the Trump rally later this week. And so the problem is, and this is an institutional problem, we also see this, we've seen this with the law enforcement establishment and the intelligence apparatus, and we see this with the foreign policy experts in Washington, D.C. There's never any consequences for being wrong. And that is why, you're right, this is nothing new. I think people are more aware of it. But when you have experts who lead us into war, you have experts who create models to promote an elimination of fossil fuels or to tell people how to live their daily lives, and then you have models saying that there's going to be 2 million people dead in the United States by the end of the summer if we don't shut everybody down in house arrest for months on end, and then they end up being catastrophically wrong, what's the consequence? There is no punishment. And so it will just continue to go on and on. And so I really, that's probably why it is still an ongoing problem. I do think, and this is la la land, I do think that as far as scientific grants go, I mean, a lot of people, a lot smarter than I am, have written about how climate science is driven by government grants given to universities and non-for-profits to come up with whatever outcome they are looking for. You know, that we're going to see a 5 degrees Celsius rise by, 2100, and here the year 2100, here's what we have to do. So they're just playing along to get their grant money. And until there is a major restructuring in how that kind of money is allocated, we're going to keep getting this bad science that drives bad policy.
I have a couple interesting points here. I think I'm going to direct this one to Sally. It comes from Keith Whitaker, the chairman of our board. If we were in a ship in a storm, wouldn't we want the experienced expert, the captain, to tell us what to do, not tell us what our options are and let us ignoramuses choose? If that's the case, why not agree that experts should guide us by being expert? That is, not being overconfident, not engaging in groupthink, not being alarmist, not making stuff up. So isn't the problem that our experts aren't behaving expert enough?
I think it depends on sometimes it depends on the acuity of the situation. I had a colleague who made a distinction between tornado politics and abortion politics. In other words, tornado politics are, and the pandemic is I'd say tornado adjacent, but here we have this threat, it's imminent, and we've got to act. And then you have abortion. You could fill in, I mean, that's obviously a very controversial issue, but I guess that's the whole point, to the extent that there's a health dimension to it. Obviously you're doing a procedure, but that the policy surrounding it is so determined by all the other values that people have, and there isn't a direct line between the data and what to do. Again, with the tornado, there's a much more direct line. I think that when it came to the pandemic, I think many of the public health people thought there's more of a direct line than there really is. It's much more, the data much more subject to interpretation. When you're in a situation where people it's an emergency, and I mean, if you pass out on the street, and there's a crowd of 10 people surrounding you and one's a doctor, we're all going to defer to that person, and understandably, and I don't think anyone would fault you. fault the rest of us for doing this, but we have to have faith that that person is well trained. So that gets back to, again, the quality of training that experts have in acute situations. Same with a pilot, for heaven's sakes. And it also, especially in situations that are not emergencies, it also, there, you know, we have responsibilities as a public, which is to be more scientifically literate. And that's, you know, unfortunately not a capacity that many people have. I'll be honest with you, I couldn't dissect some of these papers. I can't do modeling, but at least I know that models are subject to interpretation, the assumptions vary, and at least I would know that, and that would make me more, that would sensitize me to the fact that there've got to be other opinions, and they are all there, they're online, but you do have to hunt a little bit, although frankly, not that much. I mean, Twitter, for all its problems, is really, can be very informative, an incredible clearinghouse for all kinds of ideas. But we have to be more skeptical. We do have to be more skeptical, and I don't think people are. I don't think they're well educated in that way. And I'll just finish up by saying, in an environment where there is anxiety, we get more risk averse, and I think we feel even more dependent on experts.
I'll just note that the Neil Ferguson model, the one that came out of London and panicked the whole British government, turned out to be ludicrously wrong. The statistics were terrible. The programming was an obsolete language and things like that. So even the most simple safeguards against false models failed us in that case. We're about to go into what I guess we'll call a lightning round. I'll ask for very succinct answers. This first one is directed to Sally. Can you give us some references to the debunking of implicit bias and explain how it was debunked?
Oh yes, there's an excellent paper. In fact, email me, I'm easy to find. An excellent paper that came out last year and by a number of authors. In fact, one of them was worked with the original Banaji and Greenwald, the psychologists who actually put forth the original implicit association test. And I have to just quickly say, implicit bias is a real psychological phenomenon. That's not the issue. It's that the test is highly flawed. It's not very reliable, so you can be biased in the morning and not at night. And that is a huge problem. Plus it has no predictive validity. So even if you score high on your, it's really preference. And the word bias has been completely taken over. All it means is I have a bias for chocolate ice cream over vanilla, but now of course it's infused with invidious meaning, but shows that whatever my bias is has no predictive validity in the real world, or in this case, in tests that, you know, laboratory tests of behavioral preferences. So I could send a citation to folks.
I share your bias for chocolate ice cream. This is, it labels itself slightly off topic, but to Julie's point on the climate parallel, headline in today's Guardian, the British newspaper, world has 6 months to avert climate crisis, says energy expert. What are you going to do with your 6 months, Julie?
I don't know. I mean, they just, well, I do know, but I'm not going to say here. Let's put it that way. They keep saying 6 months. I think they've been saying that for like 20 years. We have 6 months. So, you know, there are so many of these predictions, so many assumptions that have been so wrong and led to so many bad policy decisions, led to so much fear. There is a legitimate, I don't know how you would describe it, diagnosis of climate depression among young Americans. They feel so despondent about the future, so hopeless, because they have been told basically the planet is going to end in 5, 10, 20 years. And so this is something that psychologists apparently are legitimately diagnosing kids with. Then you add on top of it the coronavirus doomsday scenarios. I mean, this is terrible what we are doing to our children, but you get headlines like that. It's clickbait. You can write it. Some expert can say it. Some scientists can get paid to produce a paper that says that. And when it's completely wrong, you know, they've already achieved their goals, which is just to keep piling on to the climate change agenda crusade, and now with coronavirus. So still walking around. Why is Al Gore? Why is anyone taking them seriously? Why is anyone taking anybody who's made these predictions about coronavirus seriously? There's, as I keep repeating myself, there's just no consequences. And the media is a huge part of it, as we know.
Two questions for Alexander. First of all, fab group, thank you, writes this person. Where is the line between vanity and identity, or perhaps lack of identity?
Vanity and identity. Well, I'll answer that in a way that enables me maybe to make some connections to some other wonderful things that some of the other folks have said. I think getting back also to Keith Whitaker's nice little image of the sinking ship and shouldn't we trust the captain, I think we have a nice ideal image of what we would like intellectuals and experts, how we would like them to behave themselves. We'd like them to be more or less selflessly attached to the truth and interested in the welfare of the entire group, in this case the national group, and dedicated to that. And they're in all honesty, I have met people in academia who more or less model that, who look like that. The problem is that I think there's a lot of evidence that indicates that that's not really the go-to default position in human beings. We're not very good at that. We bring to every situation, and this is true of intellectuals as well as it is of anyone else, we tend to bring to any situation of decision making that we come into a whole set of a priori beliefs. And we generally, all other things being equal, we like to try to fit new situations to our already existing a priori if we can possibly do that. This is why I alluded to the fact that I've taught for a long time in the sociology of scientific knowledge. If you look at the history of scientific change and evolution, whatever you want to call it, it looks like that. Thomas Kuhn famously talked about this in his book that a lot of people cite, but very few people actually go through and read to get the details. He just said a lot of how science changes is based on funerals. Older scientists have to die because whatever the evidence is, they're not changing their minds. They're too invested in the old model. They're too invested in how they've built whole careers up based on what they thought previously. So we have this ideal model. We want intellectuals to work. We want them not to be vain. We want them not to be too invested in their careers and in the pre-existing set of beliefs that they have. And yet we have all sorts of evidence that indicates that they behave themselves just like other human beings do here. And so it may be that as wonderful as that ideal image is of the selfless captain saving us as the ship is sinking, the best we can do might be something along the lines of, so we have an expert class, they're flawed. They have spent some more time thinking about some of these special questions than the rest of us have, but we know enough about the flaws in their decision making that we can't trust them completely. And so there has to be some ability to push back and some ability to challenge them from other social spaces. And we don't want to give that up. We don't want to allow them that unilateral position to make those decisions because we have too much evidence that that doesn't work.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. There are a lot more questions, and I will pass those on to the panelists separately after we've concluded here. But I want to thank all of you for this very rich conversation. I learned a lot. I made a lot of notes. I'll be cribbing from those notes and taking advantage of what you've taught me. And thank this audience. We've had well over 100 people with us for quite a long time, and just delighted that these webinars are going so well and that we're attracting people of your caliber to both participate on air and in the audience. So my thanks again to all of you. Chance?
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Julie.
Oh, thanks.